Margaret and Harold Thompson had been married for 47 years. They had raised 3 children, paid off their modest home in suburban Ohio, and worked hard their entire lives. Margaret as a nurse, Harold as a postal worker. Now, at 72 and 74, they had been looking forward to a peaceful retirement, living on their Social Security checks and small savings. Then the letter arrived. Margaret found it in the mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon. The envelope was official, with the Social Security Administration logo stamped in the corner. She opened it at the kitchen counter, expecting a routine notice. Instead, she read the words that would turn their world upside down. Your Social Security benefits have been temporarily suspended pending verification of eligibility. This suspension will remain in effect until all required documentation has been received and processed. Margaret read it 3 times, her hands trembling. Suspended, their only income, gone. Harold came in from the garage, where he'd been tinkering with their old lawnmower, and found his wife sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face. "Maggie, what's wrong?" She handed him the letter without speaking. Harold read it slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger. "This can't be right. We've never missed a payment. We've done everything by the book. It says we need to provide documentation, birth certificates, marriage certificate, work histories." Margaret's voice was thick with tears. "They're saying there's a discrepancy in our records." "What kind of discrepancy?" "It doesn't say. It just says we have to prove we're eligible." She looked up at him, fear in her eyes. "Harold, the mortgage may be paid off, but we still have property taxes, utilities, insurance. We need medications. How are we supposed to survive without that money?" Harold sank into the chair beside her, suddenly looking every one of his 74 years. They had $847 in their checking account, and maybe $3,000 in savings, money they had been keeping for emergencies. At their age, with Harold's heart condition and Margaret's arthritis, everything was an emergency. "We'll figure it out," Harold said, but even he didn't sound convinced. "We'll call them first thing tomorrow. Get this straightened out." But when they called the next morning, they were put on hold for 2 hours before being disconnected. When they called back, they were told the wait time was over 3 hours. When they finally reached a representative, they were informed that the processing time for eligibility verification was currently running at 12 to 16 weeks. 4 months, maybe more. They didn't have 4 months. Harold was the one who suggested Amazon. He'd seen the advertisements: make your own schedule, be your own boss, earn extra income. "We can do deliveries," he told Margaret. "Early morning routes. It'll tide us over until Social Security gets straightened out." Margaret stared at him. "Harold, we're in our 70s. You have a heart condition. What choice do we have? We need to eat. We need to keep the lights on." They signed up the next day. Their first shift was scheduled for 4 a.m. on a Saturday. The pay was $18 per hour, minus gas and vehicle wear. It wasn't much, but it was something. Harold set 3 alarms, terrified they would oversleep. But neither of them slept that night anyway. They lay in bed, holding hands in the darkness, listening to the clock tick toward morning. At 3:15 a.m., they got up and dressed. Margaret made coffee in a thermos, while Harold loaded their old sedan with water bottles and snacks. The car was 15 years old, and had 180,000 miles on it, but it still ran. It would have to be enough. They arrived at the distribution center at 3:50 a.m., joining a line of vehicles waiting to pick up packages. Most of the other drivers were young, college students, people working second jobs, gig workers grinding through the night. Harold and Margaret were easily the oldest people there by 3 decades. A warehouse worker loaded their trunk and back seat with 37 packages. The app on Harold's phone chirped to life, showing a route mapped across unfamiliar neighborhoods. "Ready?" Harold asked, glancing at Margaret. She nodded, though she didn't feel ready at all. They pulled out of the distribution center as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. The first delivery was to an apartment complex. Harold parked in the visitor lot, while Margaret checked the app, trying to figure out which building they needed. Her fingers fumbled on the phone screen. The text was so small, and her reading glasses kept sliding down her nose. "Building C, apartment 214, she said finally. They found the building, but there was no elevator. Harold carried the package, a heavy box that felt like it might contain books, up 2 flights of stairs, pausing twice to catch his breath. By the time he reached the apartment and scanned the delivery confirmation, His shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool morning air. The next 17 deliveries went more smoothly, a rhythm developing between them. Margaret navigated, while Harold drove and carried the packages. But as the morning wore on, and the sun rose higher, the heat became oppressive. Harold's face grew red and blotchy. Margaret's knees ached every time she climbed in and out of the car. By 10 a.m., they had completed 29 deliveries. They stopped at a gas station to refill the tank, $43 that came out of the money they would earn, and to use the restroom. Margaret saw herself in the bathroom mirror, and barely recognized the exhausted woman staring back at her. The last 8 deliveries took another 3 hours. A package for a house with a long driveway, a delivery to a third-floor walk-up, a stop at a business that was closed, requiring them to call support and wait 20 minutes for instructions. When they finally returned to the distribution center at 1:15 p.m., they had been working for 9 hours. The app showed they had earned $162 before the cost of gas. Harold's hands shook as he drove them home. Margaret sat in silence, too exhausted to speak. When they walked into their house, they both collapsed on the couch, shoes still on, and fell asleep immediately. They woke 3 hours later, disoriented and aching all over. "We have another shift tomorrow," Harold said quietly. "Same time." Margaret closed her eyes. She wanted to cry, but she was too tired even for tears. Weeks passed, then months. Every Saturday and Sunday, Harold and Margaret woke at 3:15 a.m. and delivered packages until early afternoon. They learned the routes, the shortcuts, which apartment complexes had elevators and which required climbing stairs. They learned to pack ibuprofen and Harold's heart medication in the glove compartment. They learned to ignore the looks from younger drivers, who clearly wondered what 2 old people were doing there. They called Social Security every week, sitting on hold for hours, only to be told that their case was still being processed. The documentation they had sent, birth certificates, marriage license, employment records, had been received but not yet reviewed. There was no way to expedite it. They just had to wait. Their children tried to help. Their daughter Sarah sent $500 despite having 3 kids of her own and a mortgage she could barely afford. Their son Michael offered to let them move in with him, but his apartment in Boston was too small, and Margaret refused to be a burden. Their youngest, Emma, called every week, begging them to stop the deliveries, saying she would figure something out. But Margaret and Harold were proud people. They had never asked for handouts, and they weren't going to start now. The work was brutal. Harold developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Margaret's arthritis flared so badly that some mornings she could barely grip the phone to check the route. They moved slower now, took more breaks, finished fewer deliveries per shift, but they kept going. One Sunday morning in late October, they were delivering to an upscale neighborhood, large houses with manicured lawns and 3-car garages. Harold was carrying a package to a front door when he stumbled on an uneven walkway and fell hard onto the concrete. Margaret screamed and rushed to him. He was conscious, but his knee was bleeding through his pants, and his face had gone pale. "I'm okay," he insisted, but when he tried to stand, his leg buckled. A woman came running from the house, the homeowner in her 30s, wearing expensive workout clothes. "Oh my God, are you all right? Should I call an ambulance?" "No ambulance," Harold said quickly. "They couldn't afford the bill. Just help me to the car." The woman and Margaret got Harold into the passenger seat. The woman looked at them both, this elderly couple, exhausted and hurting, delivering packages at dawn, and something in her expression changed. "Wait here," she said, and ran back into her house. She returned with a first aid kit and a bottle of water. As she cleaned and bandaged Harold's knee, she asked quietly, "How old are you two?" "Old enough to know better." Harold tried to joke, but his voice cracked. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "You shouldn't be doing this. You should be home, resting, enjoying your retirement." "We don't have a choice," Margaret said simply. "Our Social Security was suspended. This is how we survive." The woman was silent for a moment. Then she said, "What's your case number?" The woman's name was Jennifer Park, and she was an attorney specializing in administrative law. She took Harold and Margaret's case information, and over their protests said she would look into it for free. "My grandmother lost her benefits once due to a clerical error," Jennifer explained. "It took her 8 months to get them reinstated, and she almost lost her apartment. I can't promise anything, but let me see what I can do." 3 days later, Jennifer called. "I found the problem. When Social Security digitized old records, They transposed two numbers in Harold's social security number. The system flagged it as a potential fraud case, which automatically suspended payments. It's a simple fix, but it requires a human to actually look at the file and correct it. How long will that take? Margaret asked. Normally, months. But I have a contact at the regional office who owes me a favor. Give me a week. True to her word, Jennifer worked her connections. She called in favors, navigated bureaucratic red tape, and personally delivered documentation to ensure it didn't get lost in the system. She worked on their case in the evenings and weekends, refusing payment even when Harold and Margaret insisted. Just promise me something, Jennifer said when Margaret called to thank her. When this is resolved, and you're back on your feet, tell your story. Tell people what you went through, because you're not the only ones. There are thousands of elderly people caught in this system, falling through the cracks while they wait for someone to fix a mistake they didn't make. 10 days after Jennifer got involved, Harold and Margaret received a letter. Their benefits had been reinstated, backdated to the date of suspension. A check for the missing months would arrive within 2 weeks. Margaret sobbed when she read it. Harold had to sit down, his hand pressed to his chest, trying to calm his racing heart. They were done with Amazon deliveries, done with 4 a.m. wake-ups and heavy packages and stares that never seemed to end. They could rest, they could breathe, they could be old again. 3 months later, Harold and Margaret were sitting in their living room when the doorbell rang. Margaret answered it to find Jennifer standing on the porch, holding a folder. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Jennifer said. "I wanted to show you something." She spread papers on the coffee table, news articles, op-eds, reports from advocacy organizations. "After I resolved your case, I started looking into how common this issue is. Turns out, Social Security suspends benefits for tens of thousands of people every year, often due to clerical errors or mismatched records. Many of them are elderly, living on fixed incomes, with no resources to fight the system." She looked at them both. "I'm filing a class action lawsuit against Social Security on behalf of everyone who's been wrongfully suspended. And I'm working with a journalist who wants to write about cases like yours, real people, real consequences." Margaret glanced at Harold, who nodded slowly. "We'll help however we can." Margaret said, "If our story can help someone else, then maybe all of it was worth something." The article ran 6 weeks later in a national newspaper. It told the story of Harold and Margaret Thompson, both in their 70s, who delivered packages for Amazon at 4 a.m. because a bureaucratic error had stolen their retirement. It detailed the broken system, the endless hold times, the casual cruelty of telling elderly people to wait months for money they were legally owed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social Security announced reforms to expedite eligibility reviews. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Other elderly workers came forward with similar stories, and Jennifer's class action lawsuit gained momentum. Harold and Margaret never sought attention or sympathy. They had only done what they had to do to survive. But their story became a catalyst for change, a reminder that behind every bureaucratic error was a real person, someone's parent or grandparent, struggling to hold on with dignity. On the first anniversary of their last Amazon delivery, Harold and Margaret received a letter from Jennifer. The class action lawsuit had been settled. Social Security had agreed to pay damages to everyone who had been wrongfully suspended and to implement new safeguards to prevent future errors. That evening, Harold and Margaret sat on their porch, watching the sunset. Their bodies still ached from those months of deliveries. Harold's knee was never quite right again, and Margaret's hands were permanently stiff. But they were together. They had their home. They had their dignity. "Do you ever think about those mornings?" Margaret asked. "Driving in the dark, delivering packages to strangers." "Every day," Harold admitted. "But not with anger, with gratitude." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "Gratitude? We're 72 and 74, Maggie. We're still here. We're still fighting. We didn't give up." He took her hand. "A lot of people in our situation would have just given up." Margaret squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that had formed during those months of work. "We didn't have a choice," she said. "We always have a choice. We chose to keep going. And maybe, just maybe, we made things a little better for the people who come after us." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Two elderly people who had been forced to deliver packages at 4 a.m. because their government had failed them. But they had survived, and in surviving, they had helped others survive too.